Good evening. Thank you very much for joining us tonight. This is our third week on the Liberating Cinema film series, and I'm very happy that we're now turning to look at, as I kind of call the title, On the Road Classical Yugoslav Cinema, and as we particularly talk about the context of Croatia and the post-war context, and the films of Nikola Tanhofer, and the film in particular, H8, or How Awesome, which is one of the great classics, really, of Yugoslav cinema. And I'm very happy to introduce our colleague today, who's very nicely agreed to do this talk, Juraj Kukoč from the archive, from the Croatian Film Archive, Croatian Cinematheque of the National State Archives of Croatia. And he will talk to us about the film, about the context, and then we'll have some questions. And it would be nice really to get a conversation going, but also to open this up and to speak about this context within Yugoslavia, and then to speak about its relevance today, because as we saw, H8 is a restoration. So to see what kind of significance this cultural heritage has today. So, Juraj, good evening.
Good evening, Mina.
Thank you very much for joining us, and I'm very grateful you took the time to prepare your paper. And we will, as I said before, when we spoke before, we will also use it for educational purposes and afterwards to share with wider colleagues. So, and I think this period is particularly interesting and important to kind of speak about, because it's often perhaps forgotten or left out, or not really studied as much as it should be. So, and I hope through your talk and through this discussion, we can begin to change that. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, okay. Thank you for asking me to do this. So I will give first an overview of post-war Croatian cinema, post-war until from 1945 to 1960, in the context of Yugoslav cinema. First, I would like to clear this term, Croatian and Yugoslav cinema. While clearing those terms, I will also say something about, explain the production systems that existed in Croatia and Yugoslavia. So Yugoslavia was a federal country that consisted of 6 republics. That's Slovenia, Croatia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Serbia, Montenegro, and Macedonia. And so there was, concerning Yugoslav cinema, there was, let's say, 3 opinions concerning Yugoslav and the cinemas of the republics in Yugoslavia. One opinion is that only Yugoslav cinema existed. Second opinion was that there was Yugoslav cinema and also cinemas of the republics of Yugoslavia, or national cinemas of the nations that lived in those republics, like Croats in Croatia, Serbs in Serbia, etc. And the third opinion was that there was really only republic cinemas, cinemas of those republics, and that Yugoslav cinema only existed in paper. I'm let's say mostly in favor of the second opinion, meaning that there was Yugoslav cinema. We cannot ignore that. There was one state, federal state, but there was one state with one political, judicial, economical, cultural system. So there was Yugoslav cinema, but there were also republic cinemas, cinemas of those republics, and I'll explain why. We can talk about this national republic cinemas, Croatian, Serbian, etc. Each republic had its own production company. In the beginning, after the Second World War, each republic had only one production company, Jadran Film in Croatia, Avala Film in Serbia. After other smaller production companies were founded also. Each country had its own state commissions that decided of the funding of the films, that decided which films are going to be funded. Each republic had its own censorship commission that censored films. So only in the first couple of years, there was just one central federal commission, one central Yugoslav commission, Belgrade. After all, republics were in charge of deciding what films are. So the government of the republics were in charge of deciding what films are going to be made, and deciding about the censorship. So also in those films, let's say in Croatian films, they were all mostly situated in that republic, Croatian Republic of Croatia. They talked about the culture of Croatia, language spoken into was Croatian language, they were made by the citizens of that republic. So in Croatia, Serbia, and all other republics. For example, Age 8 Haosam was made by Croatian company Jadran Film. Main language was Croatian. There was a Croatian creative team, so screenwriters, director of photography, most of the actors. Okay, the plot, since it was in a bus between Zagreb to Belgrade, some passengers were also from other republics, so not only Croatian language, it was spoken in Serbian language, for example. So we can say that it was a film not only about Croatian culture, but also about Yugoslav culture as well, but with a Croatian mindset. So of course, that since it was one state, there was plenty of mixture. Actors and directors went to work to other republics. Production companies made films in other republics. Characters in the films, also films were situated in some of the films in more than one republic. Characters were from different nationalities. There was, like, for example, Serbian actors that were guests in Croatian films playing or Serbians in Croatian films, or Croatians and trying to speak Croatian with Croatian dialects as good as they can, as well as they can. For example, in Age 8, there was also a couple of Serbian actors that played Serbian characters, Slovenian actor Stane Sever, who played Slovenian character. So Jadran Film also, for example, two of most important Croatian films, Rhythm of Crime and Jaws of Life. There were Croatian films, meaning Croatian creative team, talking about Croatian culture, but they were made by Serbian production companies, for example. But all of these things we can say that exist also nowadays in Europe with the rise of European co-productions. The same thing here happens in Europe. There was actors and directors going to other countries, more countries making co-productions. So one film made from multiple countries, and then we can say we talk about European also co-productions, but we still talk about French national cinema, English national cinemas. So it's the same thing, I think, with Yugoslav cinema and the cinemas of the Republic. Although there definitely is Yugoslav cinema, there is definitely enough ground to talk about national cinemas, and my opinion is there is more arguments to research film history of Yugoslavia as history of different national cinemas than a history of one transnational Yugoslav cinema. And for example, the first book about Croatian history of Croatian cinema was written in the 80s, in the period of Yugoslavia, by Ivo Škrabalo, and even Petar Volk, a Serbian film historian, who wrote the most important book about the history of Yugoslav cinema, and he wrote it from a unitary perspective. He was, let's say, politically correct. He was in line with unitary communist ideology. Even he divided that book in chapters. In each chapter, he describes a cinema of one republic. So chapter about Croatian, cinema of Croatian Republic, chapter of cinema of Serbian Republic. He didn't call it Croatian cinema or Serbian cinema, but he divided it to each chapter to one republic. So that in mind, I will focus mostly in this discussion on post-war Croatian cinema in the context of Yugoslav cinema. So in the first years of post-war period, of course, ideological control in Croatian cinema, as well as in the whole Yugoslav cinema, was very harsh, as well as was the ideological control of all other aspects of life. Films, first there were documentaries, then after came also the feature films, were planned by the states or had to meet the ideological needs of the state. And they were all highly propagandistic, many of them with themes of partisan fight, rebuilding of the country, industrial success, or critical films about poor conditions of life in the kingdom of Yugoslavia before Second World War, before communism came, which, where people were enslaved. Oh, that's how they claim those films about, dark period before communism and bright period in the communism. But interesting, in the 1950s, political climate changed significantly, and propaganda and this need for propaganda was not so great anymore, because new system was established, and with the firm establishment of new systems, such amount of propaganda was not needed anymore. That was the first reason. And the second reason is that Tito, as we all know, broke up with Stalin, and Yugoslavia established more close relationships with the West. They established this so-called deferred path, so the path of society economy, which is going to be something between the West and the East. Because of that, more liberties ensued in society, politics, and in culture as well. So production companies then could make films with different themes and approaches, not only obligatory themes, not only propaganda approaches. There were more intimate themes, there were more urban themes, there were more genre movies. And interesting is the film Age 8 really fits in all of these categories. It has intimate themes of human destinies, their own intimate relationships. It has an urban theme, it's an urban film, and it's a genre movie. And interesting, although Yugoslav cinema was, when you talk about the production system, was state-owned, of course, the whole economy is state-owned. In the 1950s, also motivated by this idea of the third path and a stronger relationship with the West, there were changes in the system of film production, motivated by these changes in the legal system, and because of those changes, cinema became more commercially based, even commercially aware. Not completely, of course, because there was no private ownership, but because of the new system of funding, state now gave money to production companies partially based on the commercial success of their previous films. And also production companies had also they had a right to have their own incomes, their own financing. Because of that, they made more international co-productions, or they made services to film production, to foreign film productions that came to Yugoslavia to make films to generate more profit. And because of this, because of the greater commercialization, which is a little bit unusual for a communist country in the 50s, but as I said, Yugoslavia was one of the most liberal countries, most liberal communist countries. Because of that, the production companies started to make, we can even say, commercial projects, not commercial in this capitalist Hollywood sense of view, but yes, more commercial projects. Croatian cinema in Yugoslavia, as well as nowadays, has mostly been an author cinema with mostly drama films, much more drama films than genre films, with dramas that came from the artistic impulse of their creators. Serbian cinema in Yugoslavia, as well as nowadays, has had more commercial awareness and more commercial success. They made more genre movies, more commercially successful genre movies. As I said in this essay, for example, partisan movies, which was a typical Yugoslavian war genre about partisan fight against German occupators in the Second World War. Serbian partisan films were mostly war action spectacles, and Croatian was more war dramas, war thrillers at best. And also, for example, in 80s, during Yugoslavia, still in Serbia, many commercial comedies of low artistic quality were made with a lot of sequels, typical Hollywood idea sequels, very commercially successful. Something like that never happened in Croatian cinema. But Ages is an example of a genre movie, even we can say a commercial movie, not, I said again in a capitalist sense of view, but we can say about commercial movie in a cinema, Croatian cinema, that didn't regularly make genre movies or films with commercial potential. So it's a little bit not unusual, but not so often, not such an often case. Age 8 is, we can say, when you see it, it has a strong commercial potential. It's a bus rushing toward traffic accident, and we don't know who will survive. That's remind us of a Hollywood film, of a high concept Hollywood film. It has a high concept, and it was also made in classic film style. We can even say Hollywood classic film style, and it was a little bit commercially. It was commercially when it was made. It has some commercial thinking. Sorry, I'm a little bit my English. Yes, its creative team was made by the logic of Hollywood system. Screenwriters were different than director, which is not that usual in Yugoslav creation, Yugoslav cinema, because majority of those films had directors as screenwriters. They were their author projects films, and this film had, like say, commercial idea in the basis of the production, screenwriters and director, and some very attractive idea. Later in the 60s, with the rise of author cinema and modernism in Europe, again, production system was changed in Yugoslavia. Yugoslav government reacted to this idea of author films, and now state didn't finance production companies anymore, but directly they financed projects. Projects were made by directors who applied their own screenplays, their own author projects, and then the state decided commissions, state commissions decided to which film they are going to give money, finance, and not based on their commercial quality, but their artistic quality. So that was a change in the 60s, and as a result, much more modern films were made. But Age 8 was a pure product of classic film period. Although some scholars are trying to find in it traces of film modernism, we have to remind ourselves that this film was made in 1958 when modernism was in rise in Europe, in big rise in Europe, but not in Croatia. And it didn't still exist in Croatia. And I really don't see, I cannot see that much or even little traces of modernism in Age 8, maybe a little. It did have some unusual stylistic choices. It had a unity of time and place. For example, the duration of the film is almost the same as the duration of the story, and it's located in very closed spaces of a bus track, and in one part of the movie, a cafe and a restaurant. And we start the movie with the end. We start with the facts about traffic accident, and then we go back in retrospection and we see the actions before that accident. But those are all things that are really also done in a classical style. That's not something that is unusual of a classical film style. Also, film has multiple characters, and those characters all have their own story. So there's not one storyline, but many storylines, many plots. So that reminds us of a little bit of Robert Altman's films, which are considered modernist film. So there is a little bit of modernism in this kind of sense, but all these stories are very precise and clear. Characters are rounded, they have clear goals, and they are all in the service of one idea, this classical high concept plot of who is going to die or survive in the film at the end. And there is also a very firm, rounded ending of a film. So although it has a structure with multiple characters, multiple plots, it is still much closer to classical film style than to modernism. Also, it is film shot and edited in classical film style. Camera angles, lights, editing, music, all is made to provide us with the best possible view of the action. All is there to develop and follow the plot with clarity, as it is with the masters of Hollywood as Hawks, Ford, Wilder, etc. So, although Age 8 is not a commercial project in Hollywood sense of view, it is an author project. It is a film derived from the idea of to make film as an art. I think it's still a film, a genre film made with commercial potential in its mind. So I was talking about Croatian film history to say that it was mostly dramas, but okay, of course, that not only dramas. For example, in the 1950, first comedy was made in Croatia, and even a sport comedy about football, which is now a very popular theme, called Blue Nine. That also already it had a still obligatory ideological message, which was obligatory in those days, but it was a populistic movie. It was a very big hit. And in 1952, also a satirical comedy, Ciguli Miguli, difficult to translate, was made. Very provocative comedy. We remind ourselves that it was an it was an era of liberalization in Yugoslav cinema. It was even too provocative that it was the first and the only Croatian long feature film that was banned. There was a lot of documentary films banned, but this was the only feature film. And also some, when we talk about genre films, there were children films made in the 50s, films of Branko Bauer in the 50s and the 60s. He made a lot of, he's one of the most esteemed Croatian film directors. He made a lot of quality genre films, melodramas, comedies, children films, war thrillers. And also, since it was the era of liberalization with less the burden of propaganda, also in 1944, for example, today highly praised film Concert was made, which was really a brave modernist film of that era, which was a film which was a modernist in a time when modernism didn't exist at all in Croatian cinema. So we can say that Croatian cinema, the post-war period, was a mixture of propaganda. There was still propaganda, of high art dramas, but as well as populistic movies, populistic genre movies that existed, not as much as in Serbian cinema, but they existed. Nikola Tanhofer, the director of Age8, he was first an esteemed director of photography, and then he moved to become a film director. His debut film was called Nije bilo uzalud, or It Was Not in Vain, made in 1957, 1 year before Age8. And those two films remain the most important, most praised films of Nikola Tanhofer. His films that followed, that he directed, don't have an important place in Croatian film history. In those two films, Nikola Tanhofer, he showed his inclination towards genre films. So he joined really Branko Bauer in the mission of introducing genre films in Croatia. It Was Not in Vain was a crime thriller, even with horror elements in it, about a local village medic who tries to solve murders that happened during the night in the swamp nearby. It also had a propaganda message about the importance of vaccination versus all superstitions, but it was mainly a genre movie. Age8 was, for example, totally deprived of propaganda messages. So its creators were confident enough to make in this late 50s period film without propaganda, and it was a mixture of genres. It was a melodrama is in the relationships between passengers. Thriller is in the tension about who will die in the crash or not. And interesting is that, as film critic Juraj Kukoč stated in his exhaustive and comprehensive article about the film, Age8 is also a disaster movie, which sounds a little bit strange because it doesn't have clothing and etc. But it does obey most of the rules of the disaster movie, so we can talk about it as a disaster movie also. In those two movies, Tanhofer, not only in those two movies, but also in his work as a director of photography, as I mentioned, he was before one of the most important directors of photography in Croatia. He showed his inclination toward experiments in film techniques and style. For example, in Croatian cinema, he was the first one to use rear projection in his children movie. He was the first one to use cranes, and in Age8 he was the first one who used models. So in those exciting scenes of exterior shots of the bus, a truck, and the car, he used little models of a car, bus, and a train, car, bus, and a truck, and with a great success. He also made stylistic experiments. It Was Not in Vain, he used a lot of visual distortions with the lenses. He experimented in that film with extreme night shots. So half of the film was made during the night, shot during the night in the swamp with very extreme low-key shots. In Age8, he experimented with film structure and style, as we said. film was made in almost real time in closed spaces. And also in some later films, he experimented with color composition. Interesting is that in his later films, although he made first two genre films, he turned to modernism in his later films. So that was a great style change in his work. And one fresh thing that Age 8 introduced in Croatian cinema, although Age 8 was not a modernist film, it was definitely a modern film, as Juraj Kukoč also showed with arguments in his article. Croatian cinema until that was mostly cinema films situated in the past, World War II or before, and in the rural areas. So modern urban dramas, that was something rare in Croatian cinema. Age 8 was really first successful modern urban film. And I'm not talking about that just because of its modern iconography. There are in film modern ways of transport, cafes and restaurants designed in a modern way, jazz playing in the background. Not only because of that, but also because it showed modern middle-class society. Passengers of the bus are, we can say, a presentation of a modern Croatian Yugoslav society. Physicians, journalists, artists, scientists, thieves, even, all with plans with for the future. So this film was, we can say, also an answer to the huge development and modernization of Yugoslavia in the late 50s. In the late 50s, Yugoslavia was the fastest growing economy of Europe. My personal opinion, when I say, if you allowed me to say my personal opinion about the quality of Age 8, it's not a deep movie, but it's a very well-made movie. What's masterful and spectacular in it is not disaster. Disaster really shown in just one scene. What is spectacular are many complex characters and their relationships developed and intertwined during that voyage of the bus and the truck. So I numbered 24 complex characters in a movie, 5 effective side characters that enter 22 relationships, so 22 mini plots in a movie. And they're all masterfully intertwined, masterfully rounded, developed, and interesting. But it seems that there was not enough time or interest to really dig deep into those characters and their relationships, or to create some philosophical, social, political idea behind those stories. There are just people, interesting people with diverse life destinies described in that movie, which is enough to make a very good movie, but not a great one, my opinion. Other film critics probably don't agree with me, many other film critics, since in the latest poll conducted among Croatian film critics in 2020, Age 8 was named the best Croatian film of all times. It was in the pool before 30 or 20 years ago. It the first place. Although so it's not one of my best films, although I have a very high opinion of it. It lacks great depth. It lacks deeper insight into social or philosophical or just human issues. But it is one of the best best made Croatian films, masterfully written and directed. Well, that's it about the Age 8 and post-war Yugoslav cinema, post-war period of Yugoslavian Croatian cinema. I will now talk a little bit, since Mina asked me to talk a little bit about the restoration of the movie. Well, I was not part of the restoration of Age 8, nor I am an expert in the restoration, especially in the technical part of the restoration. So in short, I will say that it was a digital restoration of the movie made in 2K resolution. And the basis for the restoration was the original negative of the film and the negative of the sound of the film. Restoration was managed by Croatian Cinematheque, but it was done in studios for restoration, Click Film and Atterfilm. the program of restoration was financed by all the programs of restoration of Croatian Cinematheque was financed by Croatian Audiovisual Center, which is a key film institution in Croatia. And AJ didn't have any specific problems in restoration, which is more the case with much older films filmed from the silent era. And one thing that I forgot to say about H8, that it was shown 2 years before in Venice Film Festival in their section of restored films. Unfortunately, it was not actually shown because it was during the pandemic when when Festival of Venice was not it was banned because of this because of pandemic that year, but it was in the program of the Venice Film Festival. Okay, I will now say a little bit about the institution that I work in, Croatian Cinematheque. It was founded in 1979. Before in Yugoslavia, there was only one central cinematheque in Belgrade, Yugoslav Cinematheque, but in 70s, film archives in the republics of Yugoslavia were also founded. So Croatian Cinematheque was also founded. It was founded as a part of Croatian State Archives, and we are still a department of Croatian State Archives. Although in past 10 years, there were initiatives to make Croatian Cinematheque an independent institution to emancipate us from the Croatian State Archives. Those initiatives were supported by the Croatian Audiovisual Center, but unfortunately, it didn't happen, and it probably won't happen in the near future. So in Croatian Cinematheque, we hold about 15,000 film titles. Roughly, from that number, roughly 1/3 are domestic titles. Every Croatian production company has been required by law to hand over to Croatian Cinematheque a negative of the film, one not used copy of the film, and additional film materials of the film, screenplays, storyboards, photos, posters. Of course, things have now changed in digital era. There are no more film reels and no more film negatives, but they are still required to, by law, to give us now it's not negative, but master of the film and copy of the film. So until digital era, all production companies without problems handed their films. So in Croatian Cinematheque, we hold most of the Croatian cinema until 90s, but nowadays in digital era, it's more challenging because many of the production companies don't fulfill their legal obligations and don't give copies of their films to Croatian Cinematheque. We also interesting store and safeguard home movies. We regard home movies as an important document of our past, of our society, and we are very open and we motivate people to donate or sell their old home movies, which is not that in many cinematheques of the world, that's not a priority, or they've ignored this, the collection of home movies. We also have a significant collection of foreign movies, since in Croatia, since 1980s, it is legally required for distributors of the film to hand the best copy of all the films distributed in Croatian cinemas. That's also something that is not, that doesn't exist in many other countries. The distributors are really required to give copies of those foreign films. So we hold from the 80s till now most films are distributed in cinemas, and some before the 80s, of course. We also collect and safeguard sound records, mostly gramophone records, mostly shellac gramophone records. We have a collection of film literature. We don't have a library, but we have a reading room for research. We have a collection of film equipment, cameras, projectors, etc., but we still don't have a film museum. And unfortunately, we don't have our own cinema, So we are less Cinematheque, although we are called Croatian Cinematheque, we are less Cinematheque, we are more film archives. Since we don't have our cinema or museum, but we have agreements with 2 Zagreb cinemas where we organize projections of our films. And we now, we quite a digital scanner, so we'll be able to make more digital copies, high definition digital copies, so that will allow us to distribute also those films to other cinemas in Croatia that are by law required to have a part of their program dedicated to Croatian film heritage. So we as I said, we hold our projections of our film programs in those 2 Zagreb cinemas, also in Croatian State Archives. We have projections, and we will do that in whole Croatia, I hope, soon. So, well, more happy things than this lack of cinema. We are proud of our digital restoration project from 1910. We have restored or took part in restoration of over 40 Croatian long feature films and over 300 short feature films. There is still a lot of things to be done, especially in the area of long feature films. And concerning my work in Croatian Cinematheque, before my main task was to document films, meaning to document the content of the film or useful information of the films from our database, from our collections, then put it in our database. I also worked with our users, answered then their demands for films. Nowadays, I still work with the users, but now I mostly curate film programs of Croatian cinema in those cinemas that I mentioned, and also take part in scientific research, as this paper about age 8 that I wrote.